The new maid at Ravensmere arrived on a Monday, as they all did, in the grey hour before the house was properly awake, and the housekeeper who met her at the servants' door said only one thing of consequence before handing her an apron. She said the master did not keep his maids past a week, that this had been true for 2 years now, and that the girl should not unpack what she could not carry out again on Saturday. Catherine Mowbray took the apron and did not ask why. She had learned in the months since her father's death had emptied the small parsonage that was the only home she had known, that questions were a luxury for women with somewhere else to go, and she had nowhere. The room she was shown was narrow and cold, the window furred with frost on the inside of the glass, and she set her single bag on the floor without opening it, because the housekeeper had told her not to, and because she had brought almost nothing worth the trouble. She did not yet know the man whose house this was. She had heard the name in the village before she came, the way one hears weather, a thing that arrived without asking permission. The Duke of Ravensmere. They said he had buried his wife 2 winters past, and had not been seen at a single dinner since, that he walked the long gallery at night, that the servants left within the week because no one could bear the cold of him. The woman at the posting inn had warned her kindly enough not to set her hopes on the place, that 3 girls she knew of had gone up to the great house that autumn, and 3 had come down again within the sennight with their wages, and not a word of why. The carriage that brought her had passed the churchyard on the hill, and she had seen a stone there, newer than the others, pale against the dark yews, and had thought nothing of it then. She thought of it now in the narrow room, as the frost on the window caught the first grey light. "Stay a week," the housekeeper had said. They all stayed a week. Catherine pressed her cold hands flat against her plain wool skirt, and decided, with the quiet stubbornness that was the only inheritance her father had left her, that she would at least be useful while she lasted. She had buried him in October with her own hands, all but in the grave, had watched the parish take back the parsonage room by room, had sold the books last, because the books were the last of him, and she had arrived at Ravensmere with 1 bag and no expectations, which is a kind of armor, though a cold one. If you have ever been the person a household decided not to keep, you may know already how this begins. Stay with her a while. She is about to do something no one expected. The Duke she met on the 3rd day, and she met him by failing to leave a room, when she should have. She had been sent to dust the library, a vast cold cavern of a room with shelves that climbed past the reach of any ladder in the house, tall windows looking out on the grey park, and a single chair drawn up to the cold hearth, as though one man sat there alone, and often. She had found on a low table near the window a child's primer open to a page of letters, the corner of the page worn soft as if a small hand had turned it many times, and a ribbon marking the place. She had been standing with the primer in her hands, wondering at it, wondering what a child's book did in a room. The child was clearly not permitted to enter, when the door opened and a man came in who did not so much enter the room as occupy it, all in dark blue, his cravat white at his throat, his face the still grey of stone over moving water. He stopped when he saw her. She should have curtsied and gone. Instead, she said, because she could not help it, that there was a child's book here, and asked whose it was. He did not answer for a long moment. Something moved across his face and was gone, the way a shadow crosses a field when a cloud passes, and the field is bright again before you are sure you saw it. Then he crossed the room and took the primer from her hands, not roughly, but with a care that did not match the coldness of his voice when he told her to leave the library, that the servants did not come in here, that she had been misdirected. She curtsied then, and went. At the door she looked back once, and he was standing at the window with the small book held against his coat, his hand flat over it as though he were keeping something inside his chest from falling out, and he was not looking at her at all. She carried that image up the cold stairs, and could not put it down. A man who buried a child's primer against his heart was not a cold man. He was a man who had learned to look like one. The housekeeper, whose name was Mrs. Aldous, and who had been at Ravensmere longer than the grief had, told her that night by the kitchen fire to mind her own work and forget the library. The kitchen was the one warm room in the house, copper hung along the wall, and a great hearth at the end of it, and the lower servants sat around it after the day, in a quiet that was not quite ease, because no house is easy where the master is unhappy. The Duke had a daughter, Mrs. Aldous said, when Catherine would not stop asking, lowering her voice, though no one above stairs could have heard. A girl of 6 years, Lady Sophia, who had not spoken a single word since her mother died. Not one. The physicians had come from London and from York and had gone again, and had pronounced her sound in body, and called it grief, and offered nothing else but time. And time had done nothing. The Duke had stopped letting strangers near her, because each new face that failed to reach her was another small defeat he could not afford. Another stranger, come and gone, while the child sat silent. That was why the maids did not stay. He could not bear. Mrs. Perce, Aldous said, poking the fire so. She need not look up, to let anyone make a home in a house he no longer believed could hold one. And so he hired them and let them go, one a week, the way a man picks at a wound he cannot leave alone. Catherine sat with her chapped hands around a cup of wheat tea, and thought of the worn corner of the primer, the soft place where a small thumb had turned the page again and again, and understood that the child had been turning those pages alone in a cold room, while the whole household decided she could not be reached. She found the girl 2 days later in the cold nursery, at the top of the house, sitting on the floor with her back very straight, arranging buttons in a long, careful line across the boards, and Catherine did not speak to her or reach for her. The room was as cold as her own, the grate swept and empty, a rocking horse in the corner with its paint worn at the saddle, and one ear gone soft with handling, and a high window that looked out over the bare autumn trees toward the churchyard on the hill. The child wore a gray dress too fine for the cold, and stockings darned at the knee, and she did not look up when the door opened. Catherine sat down on the floor a small distance away, and began, without a word, to sort the spilled buttons by color into little heaps within the child's reach, the bone ones and the brass ones, and a single blue glass button that caught what light there was. And after a long while, the small hand came and took a button from the heap she had made, and added it to the line, and that was all. The next morning Catherine came again, and the morning after, and on the 4th morning, Lady Sophia moved the line of buttons closer to where Catherine sat, and Catherine understood that she had been let in. She did not announce the victory to herself. She had learned that the things which mattered most arrived quietly and left the moment you named them, and so she only kept coming, and kept her hands gentle, and asked the child nothing. The child could not answer with a button. What she did not know was that the Duke had seen her. He had come up the back stair on the 2nd morning as he did each day to stand a moment outside the nursery door, where his daughter could not see him watching, because he could not stop himself and could not bear to be caught at it. And he had seen the new maid, sitting on the floor in her plain gray dress, sorting buttons into colors, asking nothing, taking nothing, simply being there in the way a fire is there. In a cold room he had stood at the door a long time. Then he had gone down again, and told Mrs. Aldous in a voice that did not invite reply that the new girl was not to be dismissed on Saturday. The Saturday came, and Catherine was not turned out. No one told her why. She learned it the way servants learn everything, sideways, from a footman who said the master had given an order. And she did not let herself make anything of it, because she had learned not to make things of kindness that could be taken back. She stayed, though, and the next week she stayed, and the buttons became a slate and a piece of chalk, and Lady Sophia drew her a picture one gray afternoon of a house with too many windows and a small figure at one of them, alone at the glass, and Catherine pinned it to the nursery wall as though it were a thing of great price, which it was. She did not tell the child it was sad. She told her the house was waiting for the small figure to come down, and the child looked at her a long moment, and added a second small figure at the door, and that was the first thing Lady Sophia had ever told her without a word. The Duke began to come to the nursery while she was there. At first he stood at the door, and then he came inside and stood by the window, and then one evening he sat in the low chair by the cold hearth, while Catherine read aloud from the worn primer, and Lady Sophia leaned against Catherine's arm and listened. And the Duke watched his daughter's face, the way a man dying of thirst watches rain he is not sure is real. The candle Catherine had lit guttered in a draught, and she shielded it with her hand without breaking the sentence she read, and she felt rather than saw the Duke lean forward in the low chair, his elbows on his knees, his head bowed as if the small voice reading his dead wife's primer were a thing he must hold himself very carefully to bear. He did not speak much. When he did, it was in commands. "Light the fire," he told her. "The child is cold." And she heard the order, and not the worry underneath it that a child of his should ever be cold in his own house. "Sit," he told her, when she rose to curtsy, and he did not wish the spell broken, and she sat, and her face warmed at the nearness of him in a way she told herself was only the new fire. "Eat something," he told her once, having noticed without seeming to notice that the kitchen sent the nursery maid up last and least, and a tray came that evening with more on it than Catherine had eaten in a week. Bread still warm, and a wedge of cheese and an apple. And she understood that he had given the order himself, and could not understand why a duke should trouble over whether a maid had supper. She heard the orders, and read them as a master's coldness. The audience of her own heart, which she did not consult, read them as something else. It was in the 3rd week that Lady Caroline Vane came to Ravensmere, and the temperature of the house changed. She was the late Duchess's cousin, polished as glass, beautiful in the way that has been told it is beautiful since the cradle, and has never once been contradicted. And she came with her aunt, the Dowager Lady Ashcombe, whose carriage filled the courtyard, and whose first act upon entering was to look at Catherine, who had opened the door, as one looks at a chair that has been left in the wrong place. The Dowager had come, she announced to the Duke over dinner that night, because it was past time the household was set to rights, because a man could not raise a daughter alone, because the child needed a mother of suitable rank, and the Duke needed a wife, and the family needed an heir, and Lady Caroline, who sat at the Duke's right hand in ice-blue silk, was suitable in every particular. Catherine, carrying in the dishes, heard the Dowager say that the present arrangement was unwholesome, that the child had grown attached to a servant, and that nothing good ever came of a great house, letting a nobody believe she belonged in it. A nobody. The word found her across the dining room and lodged where such words lodge. She set down the dish without spilling it, which cost her more than anyone in the room could know. She went out, and in the cold passage she stood a moment, with her hand against the wall until her breath came even again. She had been a clergyman's daughter, who read Latin and could not now claim it. She had been someone once, in a small way, and the world had revised her. She knew what she was to this house. She had always known. It was only that the buttons and the slate and the child's weight against her arm had let her forget it for 3 weeks, and now she had been reminded, and the reminding was the crueler for the forgetting. The Dowager's campaign was patient, and it was public. She arranged for Lady Caroline to be everywhere. The Duke was in the morning room with her embroidery on the terrace in the thin autumn sun, at the pianoforte in the evening, playing the late Duchess's own music with the confidence that set Catherine's teeth on edge for reasons she did not examine. She arranged dinners, and asked county families, and seated Lady Caroline always at the Duke's hand, and she worked, with a craftsman's care, to remove Catherine from the nursery. She suggested a proper governess of good family, a Miss Pelham, whose references she happened to have by her. She suggested the child be sent to the Dowager's own house in town for society and air. She suggested finally, and most quietly over the breakfast cups one morning, that a maid who had wormed her way into a grieving man's child was the sort of creature who knew exactly what she was doing and ought to be watched. Catherine heard this last one through a half-open door, carrying clean linen along the passage, the Dowager speaking to Lady Caroline in the morning room. The words landing like small, precise stones, dropped one at a time into still water. A scheming nobody, the Dowager called her, a parson's brat with no portion and no people, who fancied herself the next Duchess of Ravensmere, and thought a quiet house and a silent child were the road to it. Lady Caroline laughed, a sound like a spoon against fine china, and said the creature would be gone by Christmas and forgotten by Lent. Catherine stood in the passage, with the linen cool against her arms and her face hot. And she made herself walk on, because a maid who was caught listening at doors gave such women exactly the proof they wished to find. The Duke witnessed her worth without meaning to, on the night the dowager's cruelty came to a point. There had been a dinner, and after it, Lady Caroline had gone up to the nursery, ostensibly to befriend the child, and Catherine had come up the back stair to find Lady Sophia rigid and silent and white, the line of buttons swept from the floor and scattered into the corners, the blue glass one rolled to rest against the cold grate. Lady Caroline stood over the child in her ice-blue silk, and her voice was sweet and reasonable, and the words it carried were not. A girl who would not speak, she was saying, was a girl who would be sent away to a place for such children, a quiet house in the country with high walls, where no one would have to look at a broken little thing. No one wanted a child who would not smile. She had best learn to smile, Lady Caroline said, smoothing her glove, if she wished to be kept in a house where pretty things were expected to behave prettily. Catherine crossed the room without thinking of her place. She knelt and gathered the child against her, and she felt the small heart going fast as a bird's against her arm, and she lifted her face to Lady Caroline and told her, in a voice she had never used in that house, to leave the nursery and not return to it. She would answer for these words to the Duke himself if she must, she said, and she would say to him exactly what had been said in this room, but no one would frighten this child while she drew breath in it. Lady Caroline's mouth opened and shut. She had not been spoken to so by a servant in the whole of her ornamented life, and she had no answer ready, and she gathered her skirts and swept toward the door. She did not know. The Duke stood in it. He had come up as he did to stand the moment outside the door, and he had heard all of it, and when Lady Caroline swept past him with her color high, he did not look at her at all. He looked at the maid on the floor with his daughter in her arms, gathering the scattered buttons back into their heaps one-handed so the child would have her line again, and his face was not stone. It was the face of a man who has been looking for proof of something he was afraid to hope for, and has just been handed it whole. That night he came to the nursery after the child slept, and he sat in a low chair, and for a long while he said nothing. The fire had burned down to a red eye in the grate, and the snow had begun outside, the first of the year, ticking softly against the glass. Then he told Catherine the thing he had told no one. He had been away when his wife sickened, in town on the business of the estate, a matter of a disputed boundary and a tenant's lease that it seemed, at the time, to be the sort of thing a duke must attend to himself. He had received the letter and had not believed it grave. A fever, the steward had written, and fevers came and went, and he had finished his affairs, signed his papers, dined with men he did not care for, and come home one day too late to hear her speak again. He had stood at the foot of the bed where she lay already past, knowing him, and the child had been in the room 6 years old, and had seen her mother go without her father there, and had not spoken since. He had understood in the silence his daughter kept, the exact measure of his failure, spoken back to him every day in a language that needed no words. He took from his coat the worn primer. It had been Eleanor's, he said, and that was the once he named her. Lo, the way one sets down something too heavy to hold and too dear to drop. She had been teaching the girl her letters from it the week she died, sitting up against the pillows with the child beside her, and the soft worn corner was where small fingers and a dying woman's had turned the same page together. He kept it because he could not read it, and could not put it down. He had hired a maid each week, he said at last, and let each one go, because he could not bear to watch another stranger try and fail to reach his daughter, and could not bear still less to let anyone make a home in a house he no longer believed could hold one. Catherine understood then that the coldness of the house was not coldness. It was a man standing very still, so that he would not shake apart. And she sat with him in the firelight and did not touch him. And let the silence be a kind he did not have to stand alone. She did not tell him she loved him. She would not have known how to say it, and it would not have been her place. And the truth of it had crept up on her so quietly that she only knew it was there by its weight. She knew it on the nights she lay awake, aware of exactly which floor of the house he walked, her pulse keeping time with footsteps she could not hear. She knew it when his hand brushed hers, passing the primer between them, and she felt the warmth of it travel up her arm and sit behind her breastbone for an hour. She knew it, and she folded it small and put it away, because a clergyman's orphan daughter did not love a duke, and the world had told her so plainly what she was, and she believed the world more than she believed her own heart, which is the particular tragedy of women who have been taught their worth by people who never measured it. The dark moment came at the Ravensmere ball, the first the house had held in 2 years, thrown by the dowager over the duke's indifference because she meant to announce a thing at it. The great rooms had been opened and aired, the holland covers pulled from the furniture, 100 candles lit in the long ballroom so that the whole front of the house blazed out across the dark park, and the county came in its carriages up the long drive past the churchyard on the hill. Catherine was not meant to be in the ballroom. She had been kept upstairs, with the child who could not sleep for the music that came faint and golden up the stairwells, and she had brought Lady Sophia down only to the gallery above the dancing, only to look, because the child had pulled at her hand and pointed, and she could not refuse her. They stood at the balustrade in the warm light of 100 candles, the music rising to them, and below them the county turned in its silks and its jewels, and the dowager, resplendent in gray and diamonds, mounted the small dais by the orchestra and called for quiet. She thanked the families for coming. She spoke of the house returning to life, of the duty a great name owed to its line, and then she announced to the gathered families the betrothal of her niece, Lady Caroline Vane, to His Grace the Duke of Ravensmere. The crowd made the soft sound a crowd makes a murmur of approval and appetite. Catherine's hand closed on the cold marble rail. The Duke stood near the dais with a face like a shut door, and Catherine could not read it from above, and she did not try, because the dowager had turned and was looking up at the gallery, at the maid and the child, outlined against the candlelight where the whole room could see them. The household would now be set properly to rights, the dowager said, in a voice pitched to carry the length of the room, and certain persons who had forgotten their station would be found other situations far from this house. "A scheming little nobody," she said, smiling up at Catherine across the bright room, and the faces below turned one by one to follow her gaze. Fans pausing, glasses lowering, the whole glittering crowd lifting its eyes to the gallery where a maid in plain gray stood holding a duke's silent child by the hand. And Catherine stood exposed above them all, and felt the floor of her life give way. She did not weep. She gathered the child and took her up from the gallery, and in the cold nursery she packed her single bag at last, the bag she had been told 2 months ago not to unpack, and she sat on the narrow bed with the child asleep, at last beside her, and understood that she would be gone by morning, and that the silence would close over this house again, and the girl would turn the pages of the primer alone. She wrote no note. There was nothing she had the right to say. She meant to be gone before the house woke, the way the maids of Ravensmere had always gone, on a Saturday, in the grey hour, carrying what they came with. The Duke, though, had stopped being able to lose people one day too late. He found her in the nursery before dawn, with the bag at her feet. The candle she had lit burned almost to the socket, and he did not issue a command. He stood in the doorway a moment, looking at the bag and at the child asleep, and at the woman dressed already to walk out into the cold. And then he asked her, his voice low and not level at all, whether she had meant to go without a word. She said it was her place to go. He said it was not her place, that she had no notion of her place, that she had never once in 2 months understood it. She said the dowager had announced his betrothal before the whole county, and that she would not stay to be a household shame, would not be the nobody who lingered after she had been told plainly to go. And the Duke said that he had not consented to any betrothal, that the dowager had announced a thing he had refused her 3 separate times, the last of them that very week. He had let the ball happen, he said, because he had a thing to say, and had not yet found the courage to say it, and had told himself one more day, and one more, the way he had told himself one more day with the lease and the boundary while a fever did its work in this house. He looked at the child sleeping, with her hand still curled toward the place where Catherine had sat. He said he had buried his courage with his wife, and had only this morning, finding the bag at the foot of the bed, understood that a man who would not risk again was a man already in the ground beside her, and that he had been in that ground 2 years, and had let his daughter live there with him. Then he asked Catherine to come downstairs. The county had not yet dispersed. They lingered over the breakfast. The dowager had laid on in a long dining room, the great families of the district, the silver out and the curtains drawn back on the snow-bright park, Lady Caroline cool and certain at the dowager's side in fresh morning silk, and into this room the Duke walked with the maid behind him and the child's hand in the maid's, and the room turned to look, and the talk stopped, the way talk stops when something is about to be witnessed. The dowager rose. The diamonds of the night before exchanged for a single gray stone at her throat that caught the morning light, her face composing itself into the practiced shape of correction. She began to say that the Duke must surely see the impropriety, that a maid could not be paraded before the county like a guest, that the child must be given over to people who understood what was owed to a name and a line and a house such as this. The Duke let her speak. He stood with his daughter's hand, in the maid's hand, at his shoulder, and he waited, and the waiting itself began to unsettle the room because a man who is in the wrong does not wait so quietly. He waited until the dowager had spent the whole of her certainty into the silent room, until even Lady Caroline's confidence had begun to thin at its edges and her fan had gone still in her hand. And then he crossed the floor to where Catherine stood, and he took her chapped, reddened hand in his before them all, and he turned, with her hand in his, to face the room. "This is Miss Mowbray, and I mean to marry her." The silence after the line was a held thing, complete. The dowager's hand rose to her throat and did not finish the gesture. Lady Caroline's color drained and then flooded back, and she looked, for the first time since she had entered that house, like a woman who has been told the script she memorized was for a play that was never to be performed. The county families looked from the Duke to the maid to the child between them, and a thing moved through the room, a recognition, the slow turning of a crowd that has been told one story for 2 years and is shown, in a single morning, the truer one. An old woman near the window, the mother of a county family who had known the late Duchess, said into the quiet that the child had not looked so well in 2 years, and that she, for one, had always thought there was something hard in the way the present company spoke of a girl who only sat with a grieving infant and asked nothing. Heads turned. The weather of the room changed. The dowager looked about her for the allies. Her certainty had assumed and found their faces closed. She made one last attempt, her voice no longer smooth. She said the girl was nothing, had nothing, came from nothing, and it was Lady Sophia who answered her, though not in words. The child let go of Catherine's hand and crossed the floor to the Duke and lifted her arms to be taken up, and the Duke lifted her and the girl laid her head against her father's shoulder and looked at the dowager with the grave, unblinking judgment that only small children can deliver. And the dowager's mouth closed on whatever she had meant to say next. The Duke's solicitor, a quiet man who had been at the breakfast on the estate's business and had watched the whole of it from beside the door, stepped forward and said with the dry finality of a man stating a settled fact, that His Grace's intentions were entirely his own to declare, and that he would be glad to draw the settlements at His Grace's convenience. It was done. The hierarchy had spoken its verdict for 2 years, and in the space of one morning in the room where it had meant to confirm that verdict, it had been quietly and completely overturned. The dowager and her niece left before noon. There was no scene at their going. The dowager had been raised inside an order that had never once failed her, and she did not have in her whole education the means to understand a man who would set rank aside for a maid who sorted buttons by color. And so she left believing herself wronged, which was the only mercy and the only punishment the morning had for her. Lady Caroline did not look back at the house. The carriage went down the long drive and past the churchyard on the hill, and the diamonds and the ice-blue silk passed out of the story, and Ravensmere let out a breath it had been holding. For 2 winters. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the small church on the hill where the late Duchess lay, because Catherine had asked for it, and the Duke had understood the asking. It was a small wedding, read aloud to a small group, rather than a crowd, the county. Uninvited only the household, and a handful who had earned the right to be there, Mrs. Axte. Aldous wept into her good handkerchief and pretended she had not, and afterward she told Catherine gruffly that she had unpacked the girl's bag herself the second week and hidden it, because she had known, she said, the first morning, watching her take the apron without a question, that this one would not go. And on the first true evening of their married life, with snow falling soft and steady past the tall windows of the library, the Duke sat in the low chair by a fire that was lit now and kept lit. The holland covers gone, the room warm at last, and Catherine sat near him with Lady Sophia drowsing against her. And on the small table between them lay the worn primer, open to the page of letters with the soft worn corner. The child reached out a sleepy hand and turned the page, and then in the warm hush of the firelit room, with the snow coming down outside on the window she had drawn months before with too many panes and a small figure in one of them, and a second figure at the door, Lady Sophia said in a small, clear voice, rusty from 2 years of silence, the first word of the next line. Just one word. Her father went very still. Catherine did not move, did not breathe, lest she frighten it back into the quiet. The word hung in the firelight, small and whole and enough. The Duke reached across and laid his hand over Catherine's where it rested on the worn cover of the book, and the snow fell, and the fire held, and the house that had not been a home for 2 years was a home again, with the lamp lit in the window for any one the cold had turned out. She had come on a Monday with a bag. She was told not to unpack. She had refused in the end to leave. And the house had been waiting all along for someone who would not go. Thank you for staying to the end of Catherine's story. If a small, quiet moment in it found you, leave a word below, and tell me which one, and I will read every one.